Kia ora team, I hope you all are doing well. Unfortunately, I won't be back in school for the remainder of this week, so I thought I'd put this video together to help you if you needed some more support going through homing and migration and relating to the task that we've asked you to complete by the end of the weekend. In addition to this task on homing and migration, you also need to complete checkpoint 2 so that you're ready next week to collect your materials for AS 91601, that internal that we've been working on. Okay, I'm going to go through simple responses, complex responses, homing and migration today. If you've already gone through some of that content because you were present in class the other day, then that's great. You can skip to the timestamp that is relevant to you. If you still want to go over it, all that content will be there. So without further ado, let's dive into it. So last week and the week before, we talked about taxes, kineses, tropisms, and nastic responses. I just wanted to do a little bit of a refresher, going through each of these, making sure you're totally comfortable with them. Ideally, you should be able to identify any organism's sort of simple response behavior and be like, that's a taxus, that's a kinesis, that's a tropism, that's a nastic response, straight away. If you can't, we're going to work on those skills and make sure we build that up so you have that competency. Okay, firstly, a big distinguishing thing. So for taxes and kineses, normally we're talking about animals, right? Whereas tropisms and nastic responses, we're talking about plants. Now that's in general, right? There are going to be some exceptions, particularly when you're looking at protozoa and some of our other little weird bits and bobs. But for the most part, when we're talking about taxes and kineses, we're talking about animals. A taxus is a directional response, so it can be positive towards the stimulus or negative away from the stimulus. So it's directional. Taxus is directional. It's one of those innate responses, as all of these are. And usually we have a little prefix, which we've gone over, that describes what the stimulus is. An example we've got here is positive phototaxis. Positive phototaxis, an example of this would be moths flying towards the light in order to food, and that's related to some evolutionary traits within moths, using luminescence to be able to catch food. So moths get what we call positive phototaxis because the direction towards light, photo being light, looking towards the stimulus. People there. Kinesis, on the other hand, are non-directional, and we split them into two major chunks. Orthokinesis, which is related to the speed of movement, and clinokinesis, which is to the rate of turning. Both of these are again innate, and you might use a prefix to describe it, so you could say photokinesis. And a good example that demonstrates both of these, and probably the most common one that we talk about, is woodlice. They both show orthokinesis because they increase their movement speed, and they show clinokinesis, they turn more rapidly, both of these when they're in dry conditions. The reason for this is that they want to move to a space which is moist and damp so they don't dry out and die. So key things we're thinking about these taxes and kineses is thinking about how this relates to evolutionary outcomes and organisms being able to pass on their genes. How does this provide an adaptive advantage? I'm going to go through tropisms and nastic responses as well. Tropisms and nastic responses relate primarily to plants. Tropisms are a direct response where part of the organism moves towards a stimulus, or away from. Positive if it's towards, negative if it's away from the stimulus. Again, an innate behavior, and again we use that prefix in front of the word relating to the nature of the stimulus. If it's a phototropism, then it's to do with light. If it's, in this example here, a negative gravitropism, then that would mean that the plant or part of the plant is moving away from the direction of gravity. You can see here you've got two plants, one which is upright and one which is on its side. Both of them, the stem grows upwards. And the goal of that is for these the leaves at the top of those stems to have the best chance of having high levels of sunlight and then leading to better growth. You can imagine this would be quite useful because we don't know which way the seed is going to land on the ground when it falls out of a tree. So having this response provides a huge adaptive advantage to that plant in its environment. This would be an example of a tropism. A nastic response, or a nasty, is a non-directional response in plants related to the intensity of the stimulus, right? So with more of a stimulus, you get more of a response, or potentially when you reach a threshold in that stimulus, you see the response. Again, it's an innate behavior, and when again we use a prefix to describe what type of nastic response it is. An example here you can see is Mimosa pudica, or I believe it's called the touch-me-not fern. When touched, it'll sort of curl up like this, as you can see in that image. And that's it protecting itself potentially from predators, from things that would like to eat it. So that would be an example of thigmotropism. No, that's wrong. That ain't thigmotropism. It's thigmonasty. Excellent. Thigmonasty. Why thigmonasty? Because it's not a directional response. It is a nastic response, a non-directional response. Phew, good thing we caught that. Okay, moving on from these, again, before we move on actually, we should talk about, it is really important that we're thinking about why these organisms get an adaptive advantage from these. Right? Doing these costs energy. And organisms don't want to cost energy unless it's going to bring them benefits. So when we're thinking about these, we need to be including in our minds those details on better outcomes for the organism and how that's going to allow, these traits are going to allow the organism to have a better chance of passing on its genes. Now we're going to move on from these to simple traits to more complex ones. And these complex behaviors give a longer or potentially even larger benefit, but they require a greater cost in terms of brain power to be able to compute these, and they require a greater degree of preemption. And two examples of these are homing and migration. We're going to talk about homing first, and then we're going to talk about migration afterwards. If you're already comfortable with homing, you can skip it using the timestamps below. I'm going to try and figure out how to get those to work. All right. Homing is about an organism being able to return to what we call a home site or a nest on a semi-regular or regular basis. And there are many reasons why an organism would want to do this. Potentially it's to have a space which is safe and secure. Potentially if it's invested time in building a nest or it has young that it has to look after, having a home provides a huge adaptive advantage, right? But in order to do this, an organism has to invest or has to have evolved to spend quite a lot of resources on building the neural capacity in order to do this. And it needs to be able to respond to changes in light, chemicals, magnetism, and various visual landmarks, and have all the brain processing power in order to be able to process these things so that it can, in fact, find its way home, back to its home base. Pigeons are a great example, and we're going to talk about them in a moment. Another good example is sea turtles. Sea turtles are amazing. They imprint on their local beach using both the magnetic signature and the scents and smells and the sights of the beach as they are leaving. And then they use that information to help hone back at a later stage in their lives, maybe 10 or even 15 years later, they come back to that original beach and lay eggs of their own if they are female. This video, we went through this in class, but you're welcome to review it again. Was amazing in covering both showing off some really cute baby turtles, but also in going into detail about some of these mechanisms and how they work. Similarly, this video that we watched on homing pigeons does the same thing, and I highly recommend that you do that if you'd like to. Some of you might be aware of homing pigeons being used in the World Wars for this exact purpose, because they were so good at that sort of thing. They can travel enormous distances and are remarkably good at finding their way home. Now, we know from scientific evidence that pigeons use landmarks, they use special magnetic arrangements in their beaks and in their brains to be able to find things. They also use the sun in order to do this. They also use a sense of smell to be able to help them find their way home. And there's a little bit more detail in this image here describing these concentrations of iron particles being located and how that allows the pigeon to potentially navigate home. This sort of stuff is pretty cutting edge, actually. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, there's lots more we can talk about homing and these mechanisms behind it. It's really, really interesting stuff. Now we're going to move on to migration, which is slightly different than homing. Migration is regular, seasonal, mass movements made by animals from their breeding area, usually to another area. Now, more often than not, this is to do with feeding. There are two different forms of migration we need to know. True migration, which is that round trip coming back to the original spot, and one-way migration, right, which is usually because the result of the local area has been deteriorated sufficiently that the organisms need to find a spot where new food is available. And humans actually were involved in mass migration, one-way migration specifically, in our origins of coming out of Africa. And we'll talk about that more for our other external on human evolution, which is a really cool one. So I'm looking forward to going through that with you at a later stage. We have a beautiful example. In fact, we have many examples here in New Zealand. The kuaka, or the bar-tailed godwit as it is sometimes known, every year flies enormous distances. In fact, it's one of the furthest flyers in the world in terms of the length of migration. It flies all the way from New Zealand to Alaska and back every year, right? That's 11,000 kilometers or thereabouts, right across the Pacific Ocean. Now this takes around like 8 days of flying, maybe a little bit less if it has the right winds, right? But continuous flight, day and night, which is really impressive when you consider that these things are tiny, like little bar-tailed godwits, they're little baby little birds. They're beautiful little organisms. Highly recommend you spending some time having a little Google of our kuaka friends. They're super, super exhausted when they arrive. They weigh like half or maybe even a little bit less of their original weight, and they spend the remainder of that time feeding up again so that they can then use all that energy to come back, which is fascinating because that amount of energy expense would be enormous, right? But in order for these birds to have evolved to make this particular journey, there must have been a selective pressure encouraging them to do that. I want you to have a little bit of a think about that if you do give them a little bit of a Google. Why would this be an advantageous thing for them to do? There's a couple of beautiful little links here which you can have a little look at. A TED lesson on this, and New Zealand Birds Online, fantastic website, gives lots of detail on our bar-tailed godwit. So please take some time to look at that. Now, there are 5 or 6, I guess. No, 7. Can I count? 6. 6 methods of navigation which you probably have to be aware of in order to properly understand just how most species are able to navigate through our world, either in the form of homing or in the form of migration, these complex methods of navigation. We need to understand that organisms can use landmarks, organisms can use the sun, what we call solar navigation. Stellar navigation, so organisms can use star patterns to be able to figure out where they are and where they need to be going. Organisms can use magnetic fields, they can use chemicals or scents, and they can use sounds as well. There's a few others which we might want to look up too, but there are notes in your ESA books which we have in our classes, pages 71 and 72. I'd recommend for having a little bit of a look at these. But it is important to recognize that most organisms will use a selection of these. And because in some locations you're not going to have sunlight because it's going to be all foggy. In some locations it might be a little bit harder to use scents. You need to have a variety of these tools at your disposal to be able to navigate effectively. And what I want you to have a little bit of a think about is both the advantages and the disadvantages of migration. What I'd encourage you to do is pause the video now if you haven't gone through this yet, and take a moment to try and think of some of these. Write them down, and then in a couple of seconds I'm going to click over and show you the advantages and disadvantages so you can see if you got them right. I'm going to move over it in 3, 2, 1. Here. So let's talk about them. The advantages of migration is organisms remain in like a place that suits them. If you're really sensitive to temperature and you are able to move out of a harsh winter, that might be really advantageous for you. Organisms can grow a lot larger when there's high levels of food. They also have a constant food supply, so that reduces the chances that they will be negatively impacted by having low levels of food, which often occurs during the winter. They may be able to take over areas which are currently not inhabited by organisms that are like themselves that fit that particular niche. So they have more space, they can spread their genes, create a larger population. There might be a reduced level of predation from this movement. There might also be a reduced level of disease from parasites. There's the potential for greater genetic mixing, depending on exactly how those mechanisms work, and you can optimize your breeding and nesting conditions to the needs of your young. If you have very sensitive young, it might be really beneficial to make sure that your young are growing up somewhere that is safe and secure and warm, as opposed to having to really struggle in wintry environments. There are a bunch of disadvantages though, and we want you thinking about those too. Organisms have to expend a huge amount of energy when they are flying overseas. And even if they don't get lost or caught or eaten or starved to death, they might be so exhausted that they are unable to put on weight at the rate needed in order to be able to make the return journey. That investment of energy is enormous. Right? So these trade-offs have to be sufficient to be a driver for that selection, don't they? Okay, we've got another little brainstorm for you here, a little task for you. I want you to be thinking about what are the cues that might trigger an organism to be able to migrate. Again, I'll let you pause the video if you'd like to, have a bit of a think, write these things down, and then I'm going to change it over, okay? In 3, 2, 1. Here are some examples of migration triggers. The key thing is we want you thinking about both internal triggers and external triggers. So internal is things within the organism. It could be things like the maturation, or like essentially the organism becoming mature. That could be things like sex organs develop, other organs develop. There's a desire to breed that becomes triggered. There might be other innate drivers like genetic drivers. There could be levels of fats. So when an organism reaches a certain level of, yeah, I'm plump enough to make this journey, that allows it to then make that journey. There's also a bunch of external factors, and those are mostly related to the environment, right? And that'll be things like how long or short the day is, what the temperature has been over the last little while, how available is the food, all of these sorts of things. And usually it'll be a combination of these triggers that will encourage the organism to migrate. And we're going to learn throughout this particular topic exactly how these organisms are able to sense their environment and then make those decisions to migrate, even if they are innate, right? And there's an example there about how migratory birds sense changes in day length through their skin, which is incredible, and through some particular secretions from their pineal gland when they reach that level that they are ready to migrate, that allows them to become sufficiently restless that they're like, oh, I need to go, I need to go, I need to go. And then they go and they fly really, really long distances, and then they eventually end up in that place where they then rest again and fuel up and do all the things that they need to do in their temporary home, and then they migrate back. The interesting thing is scientists figuring that out. This is, again, relatively recent work. And there's still a lot of questions we still have for these organisms. What I'd encourage you to do, is a little bit of extra for experts, is spend some time looking at this, the Doc Albatross Cam. This is a camera that live streams and it follows some royal albatross, or the tōroa, runners-up in the most recent Bird of the Year competition, might I add. Beautiful little organisms. And they have a breeding colony over at Taiaroa Head, which is in sort of Otago, or down deep, deep, deep south. There's about 140 birds that live there, so tōroa are quite endangered. But they have a little live camera that is able to often track a few of these lovely tōroa. So I recommend spending some time having a little bit of a look at that. Put it on, you know, late at night when you need some company. Always a little bit of good fun to have a look at. There's some information here which you might want to give a bit of a read over, just telling you a little bit about the tōroa, another beautiful example of organisms that need to be able to fly long distances and then return, right? And that process of both like homing is really, really interesting. So I'll leave that for you there. This is an example of some GPS tracking of tōroa as they've flown out and then come back, and you can see just like what sort of distances they're covering. I mean, they're huge, like enormous. So I'll leave that for you there. Okay, that brings us to the work for this week. So our plenary is complete, and our book work is to complete this task here. You'll notice that that is on Google Classroom, and it is due by the end of the weekend. I've set it for 7 p.m. because I don't want you staying up all night on Sunday. Try and get this done in class if you can. If you can't, it's there for you. I do want you to spend some time this weekend actually having a relax and rest. We want you to define homing, migration, and 3 internal and external cues for migration. All of that could be in the slides for you. There's also a need for you to talk about how each of these methods of navigation might allow an organism to migrate successfully. I'm sure you can kind of figure this out from fundamentals. Why does knowing where the landmarks are help an organism, maybe it's flying, to be able to know where it's going? I'm sure you can figure that one out. We then lastly want you to go through 4 advantages and 4 disadvantages of migration. This is key because when you're writing your final answers, in your exam at the end of the year, this is the bit that really gets you those big points. It's about your ability to think about the advantages and the disadvantages to the organism and what that means. Last couple things. Here's a couple bonus videos if you want some really, really cool stuff to look at about whales. Love these videos, they're great. So spend some time on them if you'd like to. And lastly, here's the content you need to get done for checkpoint 2. We've gone through this already. If you've got any questions, you're welcome to send me an email or to go and chat to Miss McNair, who's our head of biology, or to chat to Michelle, who's our lovely science technician. And all of us are happy to answer your questions on your methods and making sure that you're feeling confident and ready to collect your materials next week. If you want to collect your materials early, you can just go see Miss McNair, and if you want to spend some more time in the prep room, it will be open for you. That's the one between Sci 1 and Sci 2. And with that, that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you're all doing okay. Have a lovely rest of your week, and I'll see you on Monday.